Good morning. Welcome to a conversation with the Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Michael Powell, on charting the future of the telecommunications industry. I'm Peter Cowhey. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of International Relations and Pacific Studies here at the University of California, San Diego. My co-organizer of this session is Professor Larry Smarr, who is the leader of the California Institute on Telecommunications and Information Technology here at the University of California, San Diego, and at UC Irvine. And Professor Smarr is the Gruber Chair in Computer Sciences here at UCSD. Our guest today, Michael Powell, has led the Commission through a time of rapidly de-escalating financial valuation for the telecommunications industry, but rapidly escalating technological innovation. It's quite a challenge that he's had to steer his way through. He comes well equipped for this task after a career in the U.S. Army. Following his graduation from William & Mary, he went to Georgetown Law School. After that, he clerked for the Circuit Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C., and then became Chief of Staff for the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Justice Department. In 1997, he was nominated by President Clinton to become a commissioner at the FCC, and then upon the election of President Bush, he was nominated and confirmed as the chairman of the FCC. He's known as a chairman who has relished technological innovation and trying to invent new ways of responding to it at the Commission. So we are very delighted and honored to have you with us today, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
The conversation that we're going to have today, of course, takes place in San Diego in a community where our third sponsor of this event is the San Diego Telecommunications Council, which comprises 500 firms from the San Diego region specializing in communications technology and especially in the wireless industry. So perhaps it's appropriate, Mr. Chairman, that we start by actually talking about one of the signature initiatives of your chairmanship, which is the effort to deal with spectrum policy. For those of you in the audience who don't live in the communications industry, spectrum is essential to many of the key innovations in the industry. It's the Manhattan real estate of communications technology today. And like Manhattan real estate, it's often hard to procure and it's tougher to develop due to various zoning and regulations and restrictions on its deployment. Mr. Chairman, you've been trying to change the rules of the game here and to explore new ways of thinking about spectrum policy. From the viewpoint of firms who sit here far from the Beltway of Washington, what are the biggest implications of your initiatives for how they do business over the next 5 to 10 years?
All right, well, I'll do my best. Give me a few seconds, first of all, just to give you a little lead into that, because I think you can understand our approach to wireless if you understand our approach to technology in general. You know, one of the things we've been trying aggressively to do with a bureaucratic regulatory agency, which is not that easy, is to really listen to technology, to begin to understand what lessons it's telling us about the convergence of the computer revolution with the communication revolution to produce synergistically entirely new ways for our citizens to communicate and incredibly new and innovative ways for us to transmit data and for our citizens to talk to each other and communicate information to each other. And so one of the things we've done is in listening to those lessons, we listen to the lessons of Moore's Law and try to base policy, just like business men and women are trying to do, on the understandings of the dynamic of technology evolution, the pace of increasing power, of microprocessing power and its increasing miniaturization, the incredibly declining cost and power of storage, allowing you to push more communications to the edges of networks as opposed to in centralized big telephone company switches, which for 100 years has been the paradigm of the Federal Communications Commission. And most importantly, to see the digital revolution and the broadband revolution as an opportunity to get away from what I call the classic one-wire problem. For 100 years, almost all of our regulations are dedicated to one central fact. In cooperation with the state, we blessed a monopoly. And we said, this is the deal. We'll have a monopoly phone company. In exchange, you'll do all kinds of social good and embed it in that system for the government. And in exchange, you'll get this exclusive right, and you'll own the one route into every American's home. Well, if I hope we do anything, it's to help empower a world that creates multiple routes into your home. And so what we see as the digital revolution is that we don't want just that telephone pipe. We will do anything to empower new competitive alternative platforms to get to consumers. So if you look at our agenda, you'll see this emanate quite quickly. You'll see cable modem, DSL, power line, the use of the electronic grid to provide broadband communications. We have been a ceaseless advocate for Wi-Fi technology, ultra-wideband technology, policies to drive more investment in fiber to the home, everything from pinpoint lasers to millimeter wave link technologies, because we believe that if we can simply create a world where there's multiple technologies providing multiple platforms, a huge part of the regulatory challenge for 100 years is improved. No area in which that is more dramatic exists than in wireless. I think that when we began to look at the potential for wireless services, I've been at the Commission 6 years, and I've heard repeatedly how wireless functions or satellite functions would not be able to do things. How satellite couldn't provide TV. How satellite couldn't provide local into local TV. How Wi-Fi would never work because of its distance limitations. We have continued to ignore all of those prognostications, and fortunately so has the market and technologists, and those things continue to blossom. But when we look, this is one of the areas where we have a lot of control because we do the licensing function, the interference traffic cop function. But we've always done more than that. We decided who got stuff and for what purpose. So we would say, you are a broadcaster, you're going to get this swath of spectrum, and you will do these things that we dictate to you over it and nothing else. One of the things we started seeing with innovation is the system's broken. Meaning there are more innovative uses for spectrum than the government system, command and control system and ability have to keep pace with it. I simply don't have a system, or haven't had a system, in which we can get to spectrum to its highest and best uses when an innovator comes along and says, you know what, rather than broadcasting, I can do this other thing, but I'm trapped. I can't get the spectrum. And even if we were committed to that person's business model, the decades it takes to yank spectrum out of one existing incumbent class and redistribute it to another is nightmarish for anyone who's ever had to do it as a business model. And I can assure you as regulators, it's just as nightmarish. And so we decided it was time for a complete bottom-up re-examination of the way we do spectrum. And here's what we did. We basically chartered a task force, and I told them, no holds bar. I don't want to hear anything about the limitations we already have or the rules we've always done. This is about how we would do it in a perfect world. And a couple things became truths for us, which are now almost religion to us. The first thing we observed is most of the spectrum is not used most of the time. That the central operating thesis in policy has been scarcity. There's not enough spectrum. Oddly enough, there's enough spectrum when you look at it in terms of its actual utilization at any given moment in time. So the real problem isn't scarcity, it's access. How do you get more dynamic use of what exists? And then when we see the kind of things that are going on in technology labs, smart radios, smart antennas, receiver standard emphasis, we realize there's a lot of room to improve spectrum policy if you focus on the access question. And so the first thing that we've done is highlight that important paradigm shift and begin to incrementally change our policies to focusing on access. So you'll see a lot of proceedings like that. Software-defined radios, the cognitive radio world, spread spectrum radio technology, dynamic use, greater flexible licensing regimes. The second thing we saw is, wow, this unlicensed space has been a hotbed of innovation. The FCC only unregulated this stuff because they thought the spectrum was junk years ago. This is the greatest mistake we have ever made. Because it shows that when you provide a palette to paint on, the American entrepreneur will find something to paint. And the more that you provide out in the free market and let innovators do their thing, it's amazing that what was thought to be the land of baby monitors and microwave ovens are suddenly actually providing viable competitive threats to existing incumbent services and the way that they're provided. So we're trying to find as much spectrum in the closet as we can for unlicensed services, and we just sent a bunch out for that purpose. And I could go on, but all of our policies in wireless and in the other areas are flowing from that basic schematic.
Well, one of the things, just following up on that, I'd like to sort of dig down a little bit more about is the paradigm is to regulate the transmitters. And so you say we're going to regulate, say, in the cellular or TV or whatever, and we'll have unlicensed, say, where 802.11 and Wi-Fi is developed. But like, I'm a consumer, and so here's my latest computer from Gateway. You notice there's no keyboards, handheld, it recognizes handwriting and so forth. It's got unlicensed radio built into it with Wi-Fi. It's got this very nice cellular internet card, which is now in San Diego at least, and Washington D.C., the first two places in the country to get the 1xEVDO, which allows us to go nearly to have essentially a cable modem in the sky, very high bandwidth, and I live on this. And so to me, this device, which is a computer, an unlicensed radio, and a licensed radio, I don't want to know that those are independently being regulated. I want this device to move forward with as much speed as possible in all of its subcomponents, and yet some of its components now have regulation, and others, like the computer, essentially have no regulation. Sure. And so how are we going to avoid, in a really converged device like this, strange technological roots developing, because sort of on one leg of the stool they've got to go through the regulated area, the other one unlicensed, which is its own Wild West, and then the other non-regulated.
Sure. In a word, you're constantly struggling to try to harmonize those regimes so that the distortions that technology deploys because it's the best way to provide a solution to consumer, not because it's the best way to avoid these regulatory rules or play to regulatory arbitrage. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges of the Commission. I read the papers all the time describing what we do, and I'm always a little bit dismayed because everything is always in simple buckets like regulation versus deregulation. Anybody who believes that the telecom industry is deregulated, I got something to show them. There's nothing particularly, compared to, foodstuffs or other things in the economy. But what we're really trying to do is look at a world that used to be regulated in buckets. If you look at the Telecom Act of '96, which was great in some ways, but really rearward looking in other ways, it continues to further the model in which the technology of the infrastructure is integrated with the application, and it has a unique regulatory bucket. So I always like to say this: if you use twisted copper wire and provide principally voice commodity service, you are a Title II common carrier, and these rules live on your space. If you use a coaxial cable and distribute primary video content, you are a cable services provider, and you live in the world of Title VI, and here are your sets of rules. By the way, with no consideration as to how they might intersect with those. And if you use over-the-air wireless spectrum, we stick the Title III label on your head, and you're a principally federal rather than state-regulated entity with different kinds of regulation. And if you happen to get the internet stuck on your head, God bless you, because your government loves to leave you free. The problem is when AT&T, when AT&T is providing over one platform, voice, video, data, and integrating it in a wireless platform, you have a mess on your hands. Because as the applications converge and the services converge over platforms, the regulatory environment needs to converge as well, but it doesn't. It bangs into each other. And so half the battles that you're reading about today are about this crashing set of worlds in which the Commission's questions are not answered by law because they're gray. So is Wi-Fi a telecommunications service? Is the new information service being provided by a cable company Telecom? Or if we're in this morass, it's Alice in Wonderland a little bit. And so our goal, unless Congress wants to do something to change the whole foundation, which one day I'm convinced they must, is to try to harmonize them to the greatest extent possible. Sometimes that means deregulating in one area, understanding the competitive disequity with another. Sometimes it means we have an important policy objective that has to be considered by both. So it even means sometimes regulating in places that we didn't before in order to keep the harmony. But the other thing is, first thing we do at the Commission these days, which I'm very proud of, is we try to understand the technology first. And in the Spectrum Task Force report, one of the things we said is, why is the government always focusing on transmitters? There's been an enormous waste of energy not focusing on receivers. A lot of interference isn't about transmission, it's about reception. And if you look at the TV tuner on your average broadcast signal, it's junk. right? That's the problem with interference more than the actual rules that create the lanes. It's that nobody's invested in television tuner receiver technology in decades. And so we are putting a much greater emphasis on looking at technologies at the receiver end rather than the transmission end. And then we're looking at concepts we call interference temperature, where we say, hey, in this band, here's the limit of noise that we'll accept. We'll let you do whatever you want in that band as long as you don't cross over that limit. Right? We're not going to pay any more attention to what it is you choose to do, or maybe even at what power level or whatever you choose to do it at, as long as you don't violate your driver's license. So my attitude, my dream world is I give you a driver's license, you're free to drive, you can take who you want in your car, you can have whatever color car you choose to have, and if you don't like the blue one, you might change to the red one next year, don't come see me about it, just go buy it. As long as you follow the speed limit, as long as you don't kill anybody, as long as you, clean it every now and then, so we don't have... but I think that's a world that we're trying to get to that will allow this to prosper more, with an important caveat. Business expectation and consumer expectation do mean some level of protection. The last thing you want is an interference meltdown. There are potential risks if it was the Wild West completely, and there would be potential chaos and disaster if the government just threw up its hands on some of these questions. But what we ask first is there a solution in the market that can negotiate those range of relationships before we decide we're going to layer ourselves over it. So if that receiver's smart and can smell a conflict and can dynamically adjust to the conflict, I'd rather that be the world than you coming and asking 5 commissioners to retool the entire legal regime because of this problem.
Good answer. Behind every rule, there's a vested interest at some point. Somebody starts to find that it's
They're in my
advantageous.
office every day.
And I know that they're all charming. And I guess that one of the questions that is many people out here ask is, what would be the realities of laying out a plan of reform? That is, if you take a look at the latest proposal for rulemaking out of the Commission, it emphasizes the idea of test beds in certain areas of spectrum where, if you would, it's not on the main highway. It's more out in the areas of satellite links and other fixed microwave. Will the reforms that you're talking about eventually migrate into, if you would, the heart of the traffic of the wireless world, into the main bands of commercial use? Or is it likely to be that the people here should be designing all of their innovative devices really for the side roads of the wireless spectrum?
That's a great question, because now I get to use my military training. My view is this is about guerrilla warfare. And I do really believe, we have something at the FCC I said, well, who's the free radical in this problem? And we're a big believer that, one way to approach long and sustained change is to allow things to take root and blossom before the government finds it. And that when you do that, you really do get tangible examples of the value of the innovation. For 6 years, there's things I've been excited about, and you talk about them, people think you're just some eggheady academic because they never heard of what you're talking about. This commission was talking about voice over IP 8 years ago, and people are like, this is just some excuse to deregulate the big guys, right? Until you get a world where you can see, taste, and smell it, right? And you can go to a senator and say, this isn't something Mike Powell's making up. I'm going to go to your district and introduce you to your constituent who is doing this, right? I'm going to take you to rural America and show you what a wireless internet service provider really is, using Wi-Fi technology to bring broadband to rural consumers, so that you understand this is not something we're making up, and the world starts to crumble a little bit. And I do think that one of our approaches to the free radicals is to really, first of all, to make sure that, we do try to make sure they're not going to blow up the whole world, but we try to let them flourish and innovate, because it also helps us by providing tangible examples, real examples that help inform the bigger debate. Those won't come from the large incumbents usually. Not because they're bad, but because it's Christensen's innovator's dilemma. They're always trapped by their legacy position. And while they will always do some things, that's not where you're looking to get the most cutting edge examples of what the world will look like tomorrow. And so, we're putting a lot more energy in that sort of leading edge set of companies and technologies, because the FCC is a mass market regulatory operation. all right? I'm not a venture capitalist. It's not just I'm going to bet on this little company and that's going to make policy pay off. Our policies always have to be directed to a mass market phenomenon, right? We're trying to maximize the public interest for the nation. So I would submit to you, anything you see us doing that looks incremental or on the edge, trust me, is all about bringing it to the mass. It may be a tactical judgment of what we can achieve now. For example, I have never fought so hard for something in my life as I fought for ultra-wideband to get commercialized. You know, over the objections of the Defense Department, over the objections of a lot of people who had very deep concerns about this stuff. Some established providers, incumbents, who would have loved to see that technology get killed in its grave or kept out of a competitive sphere. And I can tell you right now, honestly, we did not provide as much ability to the market as I want, but I think the foothold is invaluable. And what will happen is that the theoretical fears will begin to be demonstrated as exaggerated. People will learn to coexist, and it's a beachhead that we will keep driving on and expanding over time. And sometimes, while incrementalism is a bad word, sometimes in politics, particularly in policy, where you have to bring this heavy rearward legacy with you, those are very important ways to make change happen. I've learned that the grand unification theory of policy doesn't work. I mean, I can sit around and write a 40-page paper about how we'd change the whole regulatory world, and 40 years from now we'll all be laughing about how nothing's happened. You have to fight these little insurgents, I think, on incremental ways, and they will come back. And I tell my guys, it's like planting dynamite charges. You don't have to blow up the whole bridge. You could put one charge on the right span and it will come down. And that's what I think a lot about, is voice over IP, the thing that put on the right span is going to bring this thing down in a way that's constructive. Is Wi-Fi, is ultra-wideband, and that's the way we think about it. So it looks little sometimes at the start, but when you extrapolate, you realize, oh my God, this is huge. Like if this is right, the whole thing's coming down.
Well, one of the things that I would like to see the FCC and policy people do is recognize that universities are becoming kind of hothouses for the effect you're mentioning. And in fact, our institute was really brought about to kind of help organize on a larger scale these kind of what I call living in the future laboratories. For instance, one of our professors, Bill Griswold, worked with a number of industrial partners to get about 1,000 students, undergraduates, working, living with Wi-Fi enabled pocket PCs with spatial location. And so they actually can have, when they're doing instant messaging, they now have geo buddies. So they actually not just allow other people to know when they're on the internet and then they can chat with each other, but they let them know where they are physically in space. And you look on your little pocket PC and you see the student union and you see the various places, and then you see Kathy and George and Jack, your friends, that you've allowed to do this. And of course you have to protect privacy by you being the person that decides whether somebody else knows your position or not. And then this begins to change social interaction. And if you have 1,000 of these, then you can really begin to get a sense of how the mass market might respond. But we had that going at the same time that, because, for instance, Qualcomm is one of our partners, we were able to get what has now just been rolled out October 1st commercially. 3 years ago, we had the antenna for this high bandwidth wireless up on the top of the engineering building here. And so we were able to experiment of living in that broadband everywhere. And we, for instance, realized that you could take the Wi-Fi access point, and instead of plugging a fixed internet into it, the way you normally do when you put it up on the wall, on the wall like that one, instead you can just use the cellular internet as the backhaul. And this meant we could put it into, for instance, our shuttle buses, and so creating cyber shuttles. And this was a whole new use for Wi-Fi that hadn't been thought about because the commercial introduction of broadband cellular was 3 years in the future. And so it's sort of a playful world, and you have the young people who are the least encumbered with prior ideas able to go in there and interpret the world. But I don't see many people who study policy thinking of universities this way. They think of them as writing research papers or doing deep work on, like our Center for Wireless Communications here, as 20 professors doing very deep research in internet, but not so much this living laboratories. Is the federal government thinking about working more creatively with universities that way?
Well, I wish I could represent the whole federal government, but you know, they say Washington is a company town, and sometimes it acts just like one, which is that it is very focused on the quarterly results. And it can get very, very focused on short-term issues. And here's a dirty secret. Politics is usually about incumbent vested interests, not the future. You know, I could name any number of policy debates today, and you'll realize it's not about the future. And so there tends to be a kind of a myopic problem, and I think technology is even more difficult that way. First of all, for lots of reasons. A lot of it's on this coast and we're on that coast, and you know, and us lawyers who flunked out of math don't necessarily get it, who seem to dominate policymaking. But I agree with you 100%. But you know, I first in about 1998, I touched on this realization when Business Week, which I think does it on an annual basis, you know, once a year would go to the top computer labs in the world, and they would say, we do this every 10 years and we can see the next 10 years. And in this are the trends. And that, you know, that kind of attitude is what led us to really start realizing that while we may be an alphabet soup agency in Washington and the classic bureaucracy, we will not be relevant if we don't plug in to the future and the technologies of tomorrow with the communities and the institutions that are playing with them. And that's what we've done. You know, when I took over, 45% of my engineers at the FCC were 3 years from retirement. And we had 370 million lawyers. Now, I'm a lawyer, and I was still scared. And I knew, just because of my obsession with the internet revolution and technology, I knew this was we can't make relevant policy. I remember doing the AOL-Time Warner merger as a young commissioner, and knowing I had a big problem when Bill Gates has to teach the commission what the technology is at the same time he's advocating something he wants it to do. Or Steve Case is. And I realized, you know what? Just like law, technology can be advocated. Right? You know, if you don't have an independent capability to be able to ask hard questions and let them know, don't BS me, I can see through a lot of this, you're not going to be a credible institution. So we immediately worked hard to turn it around. We hired more engineers at the FCC in a year than it had hired in 40 years. Well, we hired like 45 engineers the first year I was chairman. And we gave them an engineering and excellence program, and we created an FCC university that runs 365 days a year internally. And we bring in outside professors, and we bring in labs, and we make our employees constantly learn and train on technology, and so that they stay current in their field. And when I was a commissioner, and I wish I could do it more as a chairman, I had a rule: we go on a field trip once a quarter. And that's what this is. This is just my field trip for the year. Because I know that if you don't come out here, and you don't meet the people and go to the labs and meet the entrepreneurs, you are just kidding yourself that you know what's happening. And then the last thing I would say about it, though, is with a caution. It isn't my job to figure out what those things are. It's not my job to see what the next, you know, to facilitate our understanding of innovation. It is my job to create a world in which you get to do that, without worry that we will crush your innovation, or dampen your enthusiasm, or steal your entrepreneurial spirit, or burden it unnecessarily with costs that take you away from the ingenuity. That's what I do for you. One day I hope maybe I'll get to be in the cool world of thinking of this stuff too, but part of that is that regulatory humility. This is not the space for the government to take over, it's a space for the government to let American spirit take over. And I think that's really important. And then the last thing I would say is the most important individual to telecommunication policy right now are my 14 and 9-year-old. I watch them constantly because I know that I am watching the first real digital generation. These are not the kids who started with typewriters and are migrating. These are kids who don't know what a record is. I have had very sad moments in my house when my 14-year-old found my record collection and didn't know what they were. I said, oh, it was kind of our CD, you know. You know, we had a power outage. We had a hurricane back in Virginia, and the power was out, and I thought my kids were going to have a heart attack. What do you mean? What do you mean? Can we play Xbox? No. PlayStation? No. Can we go on the internet and get on the computer? No. And I realize how many things he's going through that are part of his everyday fabric. Can't even do my homework because it has an internet component to it. And he went on about how, then he realized his laptop would have battery for a while. So he's already exposed to battery power. He plugged through that, burned through that pretty quickly. Very depressed, and finally he said, I got it. We have a DVD player in the car. We'll go out and watch movies for the rest of the day. And so there my kids set up in the back of my Lincoln Navigator like a movie theater for 4 hours with half the neighborhood in the car watching. And I thought, oh my God, their generation is so different. But their social community, my son has his first girlfriend. I'm watching romance via instant messaging. This is the gas and sip of my parents' generation. Instead of hanging out at the 7-Eleven to meet them, you're hanging out in the chat room. There's a whole world being taught to us by watching these children. And they are just a short number of years of being tomorrow's adults.
As our children go through this experience, of course, something that they keep telling us is they want it faster and faster and faster yet. And it's become fairly commonplace to observe now that we've gone through this rapid tilting in the relationship between the United States and a couple of the leading Asian economies, especially Korea and Japan, in terms of the capability for high-speed delivery of broadband to homes and small and medium-sized businesses. A few years ago, by any metric, the U.S. was way ahead, and now we look substantially behind by some of these metrics. And the metric is not just about the percentage of homes with broadband, but it's about the speed itself. In Japan now, they're moving towards the idea of having 50 megabit per second services and 100 on the horizon. The causes of this, of course, like anything that's important, are complicated. The topology of the network in these places is different simply because homes are more closely packed together, so it's easier to wire high rises and to upgrade the network for high speed. But there have also been a lot of efforts by government to nurse high-speed connectivity. So as you look towards the future of the U.S. network and its ability to provide the sort of speed that our kids are asking for, how do you interpret these experiences in Korea and Japan and elsewhere, and what lessons are you taking from it for the U.S.?
Well, I think I'm a big internationalist and a big believer in free trade, and I spend a lot of time understanding what's going on. I think they're laboratories and they're places to learn, both the successes and the failures. I would submit that sometimes the failures are more instructive than the successes. There are a lot of, and then I think you have to be very conscious to distinguish the differences in their political systems, their culture, their demographics, a lot of things that lead to things we just won't do in the United States. But I'll tell you this, I'll still bet on the U.S. entrepreneurial spirit on that palette than any other place in the world to this day. I think there's a reason that the internet first prospered in the United States, that it's quite complicated but beautiful in terms of our system of government and free enterprise and innovation and risk-taking and lots of things that create that. I think there's a reason Bill Gates rises in the United States and not generally elsewhere. I think there are a lot of reasons why the system ultimately still maintains a very strong competitive edge over time. I also think, my wife, who sometimes runs marathons, says, it isn't always bad to be about in the third or fourth slot at about mile 20. You can't measure everywhere along the race and say, you're not in the lead, you're not in the lead. That's just testosterone, right? That's just, we're behind. It's fourth quarter and we're not winning yet. It matters when you get there. And I've seen this over and over in communication, by the way. A few years ago, all people would tell me is how third-generation wireless was so far ahead in Europe, and we are getting wiped out because they're already at third-generation wireless, and they're just having this auction, and we're behind, and we're going to get killed. And I'm so grateful they were ahead, because they practically bankrupted the entire national infrastructure, overplaying the third-generation phenomenon. I see Erwin, he knows. And I think that actually we have benefited a little bit from surfing just off the edge of that. In many ways, I am glad we weren't quite where Europe was on that technology at that moment in time. High-definition television, the United States did not lead in high-definition television. The Europeans did, NHK and Japan did, but the interesting thing is they were doing it in analog until Wu-Pak in the United States figured out how to do it digital and changed the whole game. There are advantages. As long as you are listening and learning as you watch that edge, there are advantages to overtake, and I still believe the United States is pretty well positioned against any country. Now, when I look at Japan and Asia, there's a whole lot of things that are very, very different. Much more teledensity, people live in much more cramped confines. It's easier to wire that than it is Montana, or the spaces of Arizona, or the wide and diverse culture that exists in the United States. We're also sometimes blessed by where we came from. I lived in Germany for 3 years, and I still remember my really ugly pea green phone when I picked it up to call next door, and I could hear that clicking of it costing me money on a per minute basis. Right? Well, you know what? The substitution to jump from that to wireless is a lot easier given you're coming from something you pay a lot of money for to something that's cheaper. In the United States, you're asking people to leave systems that have been flat, not metered. They had the blessing of the local system, and so it's a bigger jump for the average American to go to certain things because they enjoyed the blessings of the legacy. 93% of Americans have access to narrowband internet in 4 years after it started. Well, that means also, that's great, but it also means the movement to broadband has to be a more compelling proposition than to somebody who never had internet at all. We were gog over the internet, period, let alone how fast it was. But we got there through the phone system. A lot of countries basically just skip that step. And so, the phenomenon there is the internet qua broadband. And so it's just a different movement path. And culture. I still love to wonder why do Americans like flip phones and those Europeans like the candy bar? There's got to be some reason back in ancient Renaissance why why Europeans can't believe these flip phones we like. And Americans just don't seem to take as much to short messaging as they do. These are cultural differences in the way people live and behave in those cultures that are just sometimes different. I don't know the complete answers, but I am not worried. I continue to think that the bright minds are still here and the innovations are still here, and we'll be well positioned.
So one of the things that the United States has going for it is we have 50 states which are cauldrons of innovation and have different ways of going at things. So that's broadband to the masses. Actually, you're seeing individual states begin to take initiative to try to speed up getting forward. For instance, in California, our state networking scenic has created a gigabit or bust, trying to get to a gigabit to the home by the end of the decade. You look at dark fiber, for instance. Many states are now putting in, going out and actually buying the fiber for 20 years and operating it for, say, the research and education network. Illinois has the iWire dark fiber, and Indiana has iLight, and California has Scenic, and so forth. So these are state initiatives, and I just wonder what you see the relationship between the FCC as a federal agency providing a uniform set of rules for all 50 states versus this freedom to innovate and try to move ahead. If you think about it, if you're comparing with Japan and Korea, well, individual states are more the size of geographically to think about comparing it, not the whole United States, which is so huge.
Yeah. Clearly, federalism is a wonderful thing to one extent, and we get experimentation and innovation when you have parallel systems of sovereigns, and I think they're good things. But the cauldrons of innovation, they're also cauldrons of regulatory hell. I think that founding fathers created an interstate commerce clause for a reason sometimes. And sometimes you have to be very conscious of the fact that the nature of a service is so international or national or global in character that to let 51 jurisdictions bite at it differently is a formula for catastrophe. It reminds me of the old, I think it was Ben Franklin, the old snake of the colonies cut into pieces. unite or die. I mean, I often think of the internet, I don't know that you could cut it into 51 different pieces and expect it to prosper. Just like you couldn't an airline system, or an interstate railroad system, or an interstate trucking system, or environmental protection laws to a limit. Some things laugh at the artificial jurisdictional boundaries that we lawyers create to organize policy and politics, but technologies have no interest with. Right? You know, the internet, if it's anything, right, everyone's glowing first paragraph is an end-to-end global network in which bits, you know, if that's what its inherent character is, God help us if regulatory and policymakers and politicians want to try to shove the round internet into square regulatory pegs for its own sovereign convenience. And I think this happens a lot. Because you ask what are the real motives for certain regulatory efforts and whether they're really about empowering the development or they're really about revenue collection or various other things is an important question. So I think there's a lot of experimentation, but I do believe that principally the internet is going to be an inherently national, principally national framework out of necessity. It's just sheer reality of what it takes to have harmony. There are no internet entrepreneurs who are doing generally purely local inside state border plays, because if you are, you're not really taking advantage of the power of what the internet is itself. So you're doing something very different than what the upside is. And so that's just going to be, you know, federalism can be messy, and that'll be a challenge for the governments to do for a very long time. The other thing I would say is I think these efforts are great, and some of them we're real big fans of, you know. But let me tell you something. Remember that the problem with government is always the same. It doesn't move fast. Now, what I get worried about, it's all, you know, for example, we've wired a lot of schools in America with internet to the classroom, which I think is one of the great programs administered that the government can be very proud of. I worry that we missed wireless while we were doing it. Now, if you did this today, you would not wire high school classrooms the way we have invested in wiring them now. You would Wi-Fi every one of them, you'd bring one pipe into the room, and you would have saved massive national expenditures on tearing up walls, pounding through infrastructure, digging up trenches. But do you think that the government program is going to rebuild anytime soon? I mean, in some ways, when the government does something, it's cursed by its slow process, its deliberation, its capital restraints, and it might be able to do a good thing, but will it move quickly? Will it adapt dynamically to change? And what I worry about is you'll have these great government systems, but in a year from now, or 2 years from now, they can't, with their budgets and their realities, they can't move quick enough for their consumers. And that's why, you know, my beliefs in free market are much less ideological than some will say they are, and they're more out of futility. I just, you know, just the real sheer futility. I mean, when I look at the FCC and I look at 50 states and 51 jurisdictions, then I think about me micromanaging all the pieces of an innovation that in a year it travels, you know, with what's innovation in steel manufacturing would take 25 years. I just say, how on earth can we possibly be relevant or keep up if we think we're going to micromanage the pieces? But the brilliance of Adam Smith's observation and the brilliance of the market is that it is the most adaptable system humankind has ever come up with. It changes quicker than any central planned model does, right? The price is wrong, producers adjust, consumers adjust, innovation adjusts way faster than any Soviet planned economy, Chinese planned economy, US planned economy has ever achieved. And so when I think you're talking high tech and fast moving stuff, you have to be talking about markets. Because until, you know, the next genius, economic genius comes along and invents some state central system that can move that quickly, this is the best we've got. And it works pretty well.
Federalism, as you pointed out, can be messy, and federalism may be one of the great challenges to allowing your dream of reducing regulatory barriers to innovation, in the sense that when we look at the money in the marketplace today, although data overwhelms the traffic on any network, voice still produces the largest pot of money out there in the marketplace. For a Bell operating company, it's on the order of about 60 to 65% of their revenue comes either from local phone service or for providing access to long distance services terminating in their areas. And you understand better than anyone in this room that our pricing for local telephone services is not a market price. It's a regulated price that reflects a million side deals politically out of a complicated federal system. People who have telephone service in Harlem subsidize people with their ski condos in Aspen, Colorado. It's an amazing system that we've invented. So the next big thing over the internet is voice over the internet. It's the largest pot of money that's going to be made available over the internet in some ways as a new commercial revenue, and it threatens to undermine the traditional system of cross subsidies and pricing that fuels local phone companies, because we have treated the internet differently than we've treated conventional telephone service. You and your predecessors have all said the internet shouldn't be bound by the traditional system of regulation. So as the great convergence now starts to happen, and there's money on the table, and the market is starting to really move, what does the FCC do?
Were it that easy?
Would you like to spend summer camp with us before you answer?
I think the first thing you have to do is, your job isn't about protecting subsidies and pots of money for their own sake. It's about going back to first principles and what's the purpose of these programs. The purpose of the Universal Service Program, which you're describing, in which all this revenue is collected and centralized in a fund and distributed for subsidization, is to give consumers ubiquity and affordability of service. Right? That's the goal. If that goal is achieved, you don't need any money. You don't need a government program just because it's cool to have one. You need it for a particular purpose. Now, you know, I was intrigued because I've watched a company like Vonage offering people for $39, unlimited calling, local or no distance sensitivity, with a whole lot of new innovations. That is a better price and value proposition than the Universal Service Program has ever produced in 100 years. I mean, I have a big local regional bell operating company at home, service provider. I pay $40 a month, and that's with my subsidized rate and all the taxes and all the enormous infrastructure built up to make that affordable for me. And honestly, every new technological innovation is creating more affordable alternatives for me without any of that help. My wireless phone is a higher value proposition than my wireline phone. It's all you can, it's local and long distance, it's buckets of minutes, it's innovative, it's mobility, it's personalization, and there's very little of that fun going to that. So you have to ask yourself, one of the things is you have to rethink the social goals. It's still ubiquity and affordability, and that should be our dying credo. Every American should get access to these services. Every American shouldn't be left out in the digital revolution. But you ought to look for whether there's new and innovative ways to make sure they're not. And then instead of assuming blindly, the only way to achieve those things is to bring this thing that basically the CEO of AT&T in 1917 cooked up as an excuse for monopoly forward indefinitely. It will be with us a long time, and we will work our way through the pots of money that have to be protected and make sure the goals. It's transitional. But if every American tomorrow had voice over IP for $30, what's the fun for? I mean, aren't you delivering what you want without the distortion of a government micromanaging a big pot of money? So that's not to say we won't need it, or we might still want it, but I challenge people to stop talking about, well, look what it'll do to the fund. Forget the fund. You know, what are the goals, and let's achieve the goals. And then you got to tell me what we're doing wrong if the goals are achieved but the money's under pressure, because that doesn't bother me. I'm sure you would love to watch that line item on your bill go away. There's in Virginia, I don't know what it is in California, I have a $40 bill and $18 of that is state taxes, E911 charges, local number portability charges. That's what all that is. So there is a cost to consumers of the fund. You're paying for it. The government is not a government appropriation. So if you had VoIP and there were none of those charges, you'd have a pretty darn good deal. And then the last thing I would say is, it's inevitable. I mean, one of the things I like to learn is, I forgot, there's a great parable of, Titan taking someone to the beach and, and at the appointed hour says, I will now make the ocean rise, and the tide comes in, and it's like you can look like a great magician when you bet on stuff that's inevitable anyway. Well, you know, the regulatory titan is going to look at voice over internet and says, it shall change the world, because there's no stopping it. Because stop thinking of voice as the telephone. It's just an application on an IP network. It's no different than video or data or anything else. And so, you know, when I knew it was over is when I downloaded Skype. Right? People know what I'm talking about. You know, when the inventors of Kazaa are distributing for free a little program that you can talk to anybody else and the quality's fantastic and it's free. It's over. You can pretend it's not, you can fight these fights, but it is over. The world will change now inevitably.
Well, speaking of universal access, it might be a good idea in the closing minutes of this program to allow you and the audience to ask a question or two of the chairman.
You were talking a lot about how you want deregulation and let technology move forward. Digital TV, satellite offers it, cable want to offer it so they can free up spectrum. So why was there any need to regulate a move to digital TV that people in 2006 need to transmit digitally? Receivers need to have digital tuners. Wouldn't the marketplace take care of that by itself?
Don't ask me, I didn't do it. You know, I always get in trouble on this question because I like to be blunt. It's an industrial program that I personally question at the beginning, but I also think it's a waste of time this far into it to second guess it. I put a lot of energy into the digital transition to get consumers the products and get consumers the service so I can get the spectrum back. I think the country's going to be better served if we just get over the hump, get it over with, get it done, and get the spectrum back into productive use. And so I'm a big DTV advocate because we are where we are, and it's better to accelerate the transition, do everything we can to make that transformation, get consumers their new product. Now, you know, if you asked me back 10, 15, 10 years ago plus, when this was all cooked up, whether I would have been a convert to this industrial policy to tell consumers where they should go for television, I might not have been. But I also, I look at my situation, this is something we need to get done and get done right. And I do think consumers are going to have a high value proposition, and I think it is the very survival of free TV. I mean, my view is everybody has a little slice of the digital revolution. If you do something with it, you'll survive. If you don't, you will join the ash bin. And TV, free over-the-air TV, is holding on by a thread in some ways, and if they can't make productive use of digital capabilities, I think they'll find themselves supplanted by the same phenomenons that are creating voice over IP or cable or satellite or any of the other interventions. And so I think it's key to a very cherished part of our industrial base, but you'd have to ask them, who latched it. But by the way, and I won't be long-winded, but people don't really understand that regulation is usually about the protection of incumbents. We talk a lot like regulation is protecting consumers and protecting entrants, and it is sometimes. But trust me, who benefits the most? The companies with 30 lawyer regulatory shops. The idea that pro-regulation is somehow pro-entrant or pro-consumer is often dramatically exaggerated. What it's usually about is protecting the vested interests of an incumbent. So if you're a big telephone company, you might like deregulation if done in a certain way. But you'd almost prefer the alternative is get everybody regulated like us, because we win that game. And the FCC, if I looked at the history, has often embraced regulatory extension with grand notions of protecting people when it was usually about protecting industry. That was all about protecting broadcasters for their own sake. And that's fine, but that's what it was. Now, somebody left the consumer out at the table when they decided who was going to have to buy the $3,000 TVs. I better shut up before I really get in trouble.
It sounds like your personal opinion is to leave voice over IP free, if you will, and that may, in fact, become an FCC opinion. I'm wondering what power you have over the states and NARUC and some of the other bodies threatening to regulate voice over IP.
Well, let me take a chance to be kind of clear about what my view is, because I think there's a lot I haven't decided, and I think we have a lot of learning to do before we start making decisions. My view is this: you can come at the problem from two directions. Turn the internet into a telephone and argue down. That is, you're immediately subject to all the regulations we've written for 100 years, and we can argue about deregulating down to a place where broadband lives. Or you can start on a blank slate and regulate up to the extent it's necessary. I am a huge believer that the latter is the only reasonable thing to do, because it is not a telephone. It is a new network. It is new technology. It is new applications. It is new consumers. I don't want to treat it like the 100-year-old common carrier model right off the bat. That doesn't mean I won't be convinced that there are important public policy concerns that have to be regulated on top of it. But they should, the burden should be on government to prove that need, not on entrepreneurs to prove that it's not. Right? If I told you tomorrow that the internet is a telephone, all your rates just got tariffed, not only at the federal level, but in every state jurisdiction in the United States. You just bought yourself a mandatory 10% universal service tax. In a lot of states, you better buy some new pretty blue badges because every employee is required to wear certain badges on the premises. You better have a certain amount of restroom availability, which every box is required. You don't believe the parade of horribles that flow from that one definition. And so my attitude is, good God, we'll spend the next 30 years trying to get rid of that stuff. Now, if 911 is a critical service to voice over IP, fine, let's isolate that problem and solve 911 on voice over IP. If law enforcement has concern about technology moving, fine, let's solve that problem. That's another thing maybe we'll do, universal service. But I think that list is small. We're talking about 4 or 5 current critical items that probably have to be addressed versus hundreds of pages that you try to forbear from for the next eternity. So that's really my view. Now, what those things are or how you get there is complicated. With respect to the states, it's just a federal system. There's a role for the states, but I think that the key here is, where does economic regulation rest, if anywhere? Not consumer protection stuff, but economic regulation. And I'm personally strongly of the view it's an interstate service. I don't know whether it's internet or telephone, but I know it's not local. And I believe very strongly that the internet, it's more like wireless, which is a federal interstate service, or long distance, which is a federal interstate service, than it is like local phone service. And I think so, I do believe the FCC is the principal regulatory authority, no matter what kind of service it is, because no matter what kind it is, it's interstate in nature, which in essence means that no one state is in a position to regulate it in its entirety, just like wireless, just like long-distance service, and that's where I start from. Now, we're working with states to understand what their concerns and make sure we have a role, but I'm not going to abdicate that I think the FCC is first in line to set the initial regulatory environment, and that's the only way that it could be. And we have, if we want it, plenty of power to assert ourselves in that way. Preemptive power and classification power. And if you look, some of the courts that have already started to look at it have generally ruled that way, that this service is interstate in nature, it's more internet than not. So we'll see, but that's the way it's going to go.
Mr. Chairman, I ask this as a businessman, not as a student. You spoke about hiring 45 engineers. Do you pay, or are you happy with the wages you pay and the ability to attract talent, or do you find yourself losing talent to the business marketplace?
Unfortunately, the business marketplace collapsed while I needed them, so your loss was my gain. A lot of people looking for work. I will tell you, we were very thoughtful about it. I went out to business schools, to engineering schools. We talked to engineers, what motivates engineers, what parts of their careers do they need to be doing certain things, what does a young, newly graduated engineer do or want to do, what does a mid-level engineer do or want to do, what do senior engineers, and we tried to really develop a recruiting program that was kind of premised on a successful engineer's career with an argument that a stint in public policy is advancing of that career if slotted in the right way. And that's the way we went about it.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I, in 3 years at working at the Commission, never was able to tell a chairman that your time has come to an end, but now I do. And I want to thank you very much on behalf of the University of California, San Diego for being with us today.